Thanks everyone for coming. It is such an honor to be here and be on stage with an inspiring group of people. So what I'm going to be doing today is talking about our new Bitcoin Adoption Index. This is the first time I'm presenting any of the data. There are helpful cheat sheets that were on or now probably below your seats, and I'm indebted to Renee from the Bitcoin Policy Institute for putting those together, and to the Reynolds Foundation and HRF for sponsoring this project. So before diving into it, I wanted to provide a little bit of context and a quick story that I think also illustrates the importance of all of this interpersonal connection that we've been building the last few days. So it was probably about 15 months ago, after Bitcoin Atlantis, I guess that was 14 months ago, and Alex Gladstein and I we were on the same flight back to the US, and our flight was canceled. And so we had 7 hours stuck in Lisbon. I know there are definitely worse places to be stuck. And we turned lemon into lemonade, talking about, for most of the 7 hours, these kinds of issues. And sort of central to that was this idea that there were so many misperceptions around Bitcoin. Why does everyone just associate it with illicit uses and speculation that in fact, and this is where he and I have a real shared interest, in the way in which central banks control states' monetary policy, which is something I wrote a book about that he helped me see the Bitcoin connection on. And so we started talking about how Bitcoin is a tool of financial freedom around the world, but there's not a lot of systematic evidence about where and how that's being done. And he said he really wanted to do a big global survey to actually have data on that. And I said, well, that's the work I do. I do public opinion work, I do public attitudes, I do international opinion. So why don't we collaborate on this? And so this is really, I shouldn't say the culmination. We're starting the second year of this project. We've spent the last year developing the survey and running the survey in 25 countries. And so the goal, there's many goals of this project, really to learn how people are using Bitcoin and stable coins in the pursuit of financial freedom, understanding what drives Bitcoin adoption, not necessarily, but also on average around the world, but in specific use cases in these individual countries, so that we can then help policymakers, businesses, communities make better decisions about Bitcoin regulations, products, and education, and improve if we think of Bitcoin as a tool of financial freedom, so how can we improve access? And then lastly, educate the public about the impact on society. Full disclosure, so I come at this from the perspective of an academic, so I teach at Cornell. And so we have a big research design because we wanted to be systematic about it. We didn't want to cherry pick countries that we know that this is where Bitcoin is being used. We really wanted to be systematic about it. And to our knowledge, this is the largest ever cross-national study of Bitcoin perceptions and adoption that we're aware of. So I know, for example, Chainalysis has some study, but this is all crypto, and it's based on indirect proxies. We actually went into 25 countries and asked 25,000 people about their use of Bitcoin. We've also followed up, and I've talked to quite a few of you in the different countries to do qualitative interviews, to actually understand how people are on the ground using Bitcoin, what's standing in the way of broader adoption. So it's been great to talk to you. I'm working with Ella Huff from Cornell, and she has this team of students that's doing all these interviews. So it's been such a rich experience. I am going to present some data, but I'm also going to be telling your stories. And so I appreciate that privilege of being able to talk to you and talk to people on the ground who are actually using Bitcoin. So again, we wanted to be systematic about this. We started when Alex and I were talking about this, thinking about 5 countries, maybe 10. And so there was a little bit of mission creep. So we ended up with 25. But the more we got into this, the more we just thought, if we can tell a really cool story about not just 5, 10 countries, 25 countries, every major continent, big countries, small countries, mostly non-democracies, but we wanted to throw in some democracies too to kind of benchmark and all major religions. And so these are the countries that we have surveyed over the last year. So it's been such a fun project. Okay, so disclaimer, here's a little bit of data. What you want to see here is anything that's pushed to the left means that there's a less likelihood story going on. So this is not an unusual story. So essentially what we find here, this is across these countries. If you are female, you are less likely to be using Bitcoin. Right. And so this is foreshadowing some of the outreach work that I'm going to talk about at the end. So where are these unequal uses or access? Age is also probably not surprising. Look around the room. So as you get older, you're less likely to say that you've used Bitcoin or that you are using Bitcoin. And I should say, by the way, we have probably 5 to 7 different measures. Like, are you aware of Bitcoin? Do you use it on a daily basis? How much of your wealth is in Bitcoin? And so we really wanted to get, and we have all that texture that I can't get into here, but I'll be wandering around after. If anyone wants to ask me about the study, I'm happy to talk more about it. It's also tends to be something that is more sort of dominantly used as you get more college education. So if you are college educated, you have a greater probability of having owned Bitcoin. Again, foreshadowing where we can do some kind of legwork to close those gaps. Okay, so this is an aggregate. So where do we see the highest use of Bitcoin around the world? So as you get higher, that's lower usage. And this is the question of have you or do you own Bitcoin? And so, El Salvador, very high rates. I spent some time there talking to people. And Alex was talking about this early on. Just the government did such an aggressive job in promoting Bitcoin and Chivo wallets. So it's not surprising. But I think the other thing that's really interesting to point out here is that generally, as you go down and darker, that's the higher use. These are not, democracies necessarily. So you do have this kind of hinting at what is going on here with this mechanism that people are using Bitcoin for financial freedom. So then we really wanted to start unpacking these mechanisms, and this is where these stories have really emerged. So I'm kind of showing this aggregate data here, but like I said, we've been doing dozens of interviews. I think we're going to get up to about 250 across these 25 countries. And so I included some kind of evidence and stories on the right here that you can read as well as I can say them. So I'll let you read them. But I think what you can see here, the real takeaway is that these countries are using Bitcoin in that spirit of financial freedom in these countries like Turkey, where inflation is debasing the currency, devaluing their wealth. So theft through debasement is eroding morals and trust on a societal level. Bitcoin prevents this by being nearly impossible to steal. And we've seen that in country after country, whether it's Argentina, Venezuela, Turkey, the way in which people are using it as a hedge, a store of value for what they've worked for. We see this as well in the context of remittances. Here I'll point to the case of Venezuela. Many people in Venezuela don't want to receive transfers to their local bank accounts for obvious reasons. Again, I think there's more work to do here. When I was in El Salvador, it was, despite how much that can actually save in all of those steps of remittances, it's still being underutilized, I would say. And here, as we started at the beginning of the project, brainstorming, well, what are the reasons why people in these countries might be using Bitcoin? A big one, and again, I've spoken to a few of you about this issue. I'm thinking about Fede, about the case of Nigeria. Bitcoin as a tool for the unbanked. So many cases of this. And I think, I think about the US context for Bitcoin and kind of how that frames how policymakers think about Bitcoin. And again, this sort of used as speculation. And I think what gets missed in that conversation is just the fact that if you live in parts of the world, you might not have an address. You might not want to give your information to a bank that can use it or give that information to the federal government. And so we saw this again over and over. Again, this Nigerian case, Bitcoin gives Africans a way to access global markets without going through the existing system. And so it's clear that people are using Bitcoin around the world as a substitute for their lack of access or trust in the banking system. We also saw a lot of evidence over and over, Bitcoin as a way of kind of getting out from the yoke of financial repression. And I'll pick here the case of Lebanon. The government's corruption and misinformation drove me to Bitcoin. It was the only way to protect my wealth. So over and over in these non-democracies or cases where there's repression, individuals in these countries are moving to Bitcoin as a way around that. So we ask people to try to understand kind of why are they using Bitcoin, why are they not using Bitcoin? And again, I think this points to the education takeaways here, that for a lot of educators in this room, what are the things you think about? What are the things to emphasize? And so in all but 3 countries, so 22 countries, more than 50% of the people said they were concerned about volatility. So that just kept coming up and coming up. There's still a real just technical misunderstanding about how to use it. So that's another one. In all but 6 countries, so 19 countries, more than 50% of the population said that Bitcoin is confusing. And so there again, I think we can see opportunities for education. A lot of people say they just don't have adequate knowledge of Bitcoin, or that they don't trust it. The last one I thought was very interesting and is that in all but 5 countries, people said they use Bitcoin for privacy. So I thought that was a really good kind of takeaway too, that they trust Bitcoin as a way to preserve their privacy. So what do we take away from this? And I think that's probably the stories are, I think, the most interesting aspect, but what are the sort of recommendations that flow from this, whether it's policymakers or educators? I think one really stands out to me is that we need to expand financial inclusion programs. So we still have confusion, we have a sense of risk, we have low knowledge, even in some of these high adoption countries. So we should be scaling and funding and scaling culturally adapted, country-specific Bitcoin education initiatives. And I think that's what a lot of people in the room are doing. I think what this points to is that there's no one-size-fits-all story. And so now we're going to have the evidence that allows us to make more tailored and targeted interventions. And I think part of that targeting is kind of where we see these gaps, the age, the gender, the education programs. A second area is to protect peer-to-peer access in these underserved or repressive environments. The interviews we did in Nigeria, Lebanon, Ukraine emphasized the role where banking systems are exclusionary or weaponized. So here again, I think we can point to policy recommendations that are informed by this analysis. So Lightning-based remittance apps, self-custody platforms, more of that should be supported. And then third is to think about more how to integrate Bitcoin into humanitarian and remittance infrastructure. So working with humanitarian and aid and remittance organizations to pilot Bitcoin-based transfer alongside fiat systems. So just to kind of pull this all together, and I should say that Ella, who many of you know, has taken most of these pictures, doing her legwork in education, is that what we found is that just being aware of Bitcoin does not mean, is not equivalent to ownership. And I didn't touch on that earlier, but essentially we had much higher levels of awareness of Bitcoin than when people were asked and reported about their ownership. So there's a gap there that I think we can start to try to close. There's still a real sense that the perception of risk is holding people back. And so I think there also are opportunities to educate on kind of relative risk and volatility compared to other assets that they might think are safer. And that confusion is still really a barrier, whether it's the technical side or the kind of how you actually kind of brass tacks can adopt or use Bitcoin is clearly still an impediment for people. So I think the real takeaway from all of this is that this informs how we can think about targeted education and engagement and use evidence-based intervention. And so until now, we haven't had the evidence by country to know kind of how are these countries different, and now we do. And so what we're trying to develop now is a set of educational initiatives, and again, kind of leaning into what we do well, or would like to think that we do well in a university is, as political scientists and economists, is randomized control trials that try to actually empirically evaluate those targeted interventions to see kind of how they work compared to control groups so that we can further refine our approach. This has been probably the best project that I've worked on in my time at a university. And so I'm so excited to now, in the coming year, be developing those initiatives, talking to more of you, and thinking how we can work together to educate people and increase the access to these tools of financial freedom. So thank you so much for being here.